Matthew chapter 5, verse 48. Matthew chapter 5, verse 48. This is part of Jesus' sayings on the Sermon of the Mount. And in verse 48, Jesus says, "Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father which is in heaven is perfect." May the Lord bless us as we hear his word.
The spiritually assured among us are certain that that text needs to be applied more broadly. The conscientious and conscientiously fearful among us are certain that that text is telling them they're never going to make it anyway. And the argumentative among us would love to do nothing more than spend all Sabbath arguing about the nature of perfection and becoming very imperfect in their extolling what perfection should be. So in the midst of this cacophony of sounds and noises, the question comes, what did Jesus mean when he said, "Be perfect just as your Father in heaven is perfect"? Well, one of the things that we could say for certain is that whatever he was intoning, it certainly wasn't like much of what we hear today regarding perfection. Indeed, it seems like people who should be thankful that we live in a country where freedom of thought and religion is allowed, it's amazing how many people, maybe even in the Adventist church, who are unwilling to accord any kind of spiritual benefit to a brother or sister who views or explains this topic just a little bit differently than they do. And so we have this interesting phenomenon of garish imperfection masked as a trumpeting for perfection. And then we have to ask ourselves, well, where are we headed in all this? What does this all mean? We know, for example, that, as I alluded to earlier, the conscientious among us find this text very depleting, very discouraging, very difficult, and downright condemning. And so it was a number of years ago when my dad was taking graduate work in, I believe it was Oregon State University. He had a major professor who had trained for the priesthood, I believe it was, and who was now a caustic, doubting, philosophical professor at the university. And one day in class, the professor mentioned this text. And I believe he even shared his own journey enough so that the students knew that as far as he was concerned, that text rolled him out of being interested in being a mouthpiece for God. And when my dad heard him say that, the Lord laid on my dad's heart the burden to go and talk with that professor. And so you had to try twice, I think. Somebody there the other times, or at least one other time. And finally my dad had a one-on-one conversation with the professor. And my dad shared his interest in the professor's enunciation of his relationship to Matthew 5:48. be ye perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. To this professor, that was an absolute impossibility that only mocked his best efforts. And he was very, very troubled, to the point that it changed the trajectory of his life. On that interesting day, my dad was able to share with his precious soul the comfort, the assurance, the arrangement of heaven to get as many of you, as many of us, in through those pearly gates as God can possibly squeeze through. And when we look at the entire corpus of Scripture, and indeed when we look at the sayings of Jesus more closely, we realize that this is not a call to futility and an ignominious disaster. This is a call to lean on the everlasting arms. This is a call to sing, "'Tis so sweet to trust in myself." No. To trust in Jesus, just to take him at his word. And as we ingest this personally, we become beacons of light and hope instead of pile drivers of discouragement and trouble. And I would suggest that too many times we have misused this text and the concept of perfectness only to the detriment of the spiritual life of many souls. Actually, it would have only taken a short visit to understand more fully what Jesus was really talking about here. If you back up, as Armando alluded to so nicely, this is actually part of the Sermon on the Mount. And it's actually the specific part that teaches us how to relate to people that are ornery and people in the Amicus Church who didn't treat us right, and people close by us who just don't get it like I get it. And they're frustrating, these fellow saints that don't understand perfection as perfectly as I do. And so Jesus is trying to create a model of personal interaction. Jesus, who is the great HR director. He was the dean of human relations directors. And he was the one who taught us, "Our Father which art in heaven, let us indeed forgive others as God forgives us." And as a early pioneer of the Adventist Church wrote so eloquently, we need to regard ourselves as missionaries first of all to those closest around us. And we love to tell stories of Missionary Smith and Missionary Jones going to some heathen land and taking it in the chin as people treated them rudely and meanly and very discouragingly. And yet they persevered. And we all grin from ear to ear at church and say, "Yes, I gave my dollar bill to help Preacher Smith get there. That is so wonderful." And then we turn around and demand that people that are very close to us explain the Scripture just the way we do. And if they don't phrase it just right, we're ready to correct them in love. We're ready to shape up their twisted, unclear, foggy, and vague theology so that we can clarify truth for them. Now, of course, as with all errors, there's some kernels of truth in that. We do want to share the truth. We do want to people to the pristine gospel, but it's how we do it. And that Jesus spent so much time to try to teach us to be deferential and kind and not speaking things unconsciously as if, well, you made a little contribution. That was okay. It's kind of kindergartenish, maybe second grade. But let me tell you what it really means. God help us so that we can be ministers truly of the perfect love of Jesus, who for our sakes became poor, that we, through his poverty, might become rich. And oh, how much we need the riches of Jesus. How many times have we had to face situations where people, thinking they were holding off high the standards, were really mercilessly cutting people down in the trenches? Fellow travelers who needed a word of encouragement, who needed help in affirming whatever little faith they might have had. And instead, we seem to be fancying ourselves as 21st century John the Baptist, as we interpret him to be. It's a very, very sad situation. And Jesus, when he gave these words, "Be ye therefore perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect," we know, of course, that he didn't enunciate it in English, whether King James or a modern translation. We know that he said it in a language quite foreign to ours. We know that there were tones which we cannot possibly capture. But we also know that even from our own reading of our English Bibles, that there was a whole lot more that Jesus was speaking about when he made this statement in Matthew 5:48. A great deal more than we take it to be. And so if your pure minds are ready and able, I'm going to invite you to use your tactile, senses, to use your visual perceptors, and not just to sit in this church service as if I'm a television program, and to actually grab a Bible or your phone, I don't care, and turn to this same incident as recorded by a friend of Matthew's. You see, God thought it so important for you to keep your individuality that he arranged to have 4 distinct personalities tell you what his mission was like. And so you've got Mark, the fellow who runs so fast that you're halfway through Jesus' ministry before you can hardly get it. Try it sometime. Look at the book of Mark. And then there's Matthew, who wants to give you detail and the kingliness of Jesus' heritage. And there's our friend Luke. And Luke, of course, was very educated. And he wants you to know, particularly when he gives his other book there that follows the book of John, he wants you to know that he did a lot of research on this. And he pulled together many things. And he was the original Google. And Luke really had it together. And then there was John. John was the youngest. He didn't really know a lot. He wasn't highly trained. His language, scholars tell us, is certainly not the language of Paul, but it's an interesting phenomenon happened on the way to church. John gives just as true a message, just as clear, just as understandable, and some would say more, than even Paul, because all Scripture is inspired by God. But all the Scriptures have their the Bible writers have their own personality stamped in these 66 books. It's an incredible story. And that's why the book of John, you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They're called synoptic gospels. They kind of parallel each other. But John, he's just doing his own thing. Because he was the youngest anyway, and he probably wasn't as disciplined or as knowledgeable about how things are done. And he just loved Jesus. And he just wanted to lean on Jesus' breast. And he wanted to be close to his friend Jesus. And John, he just goes off in his own narrative as to the life of Christ. And it's just so interesting because every one of them are equally inspired. But each of them have their own contribution. And it's so wonderful because we might be in danger of misusing Matthew 5:48. We might have been in danger, I don't know if you've ever heard anybody do this, of making lists and telling everybody, this is how we're going to be perfect. We're going to do this, this, and this, and now we're perfect. In fact, I'm pretty sure I haven't sinned in 16 and a half months. I know what perfection is. And then we look at what Luke says Jesus said on that same occasion. And we begin to understand, maybe I'm not as perfect as I thought. And maybe I don't even understand perfection at all. And so, if you have a parallel rendition of the New Testament, that is of the Gospels, and we call it a harmony, where all the same incidences, in other words, one incident that's recorded in the Gospels, it's all put together. So some of Jesus' sayings and doings are recorded by all four, particularly his last hours. Some of them are recorded by two, some by three, and some by only one. And so when we look at the Sermon on the Mount, we have both Matthew and Luke telling us what happened that day. The book Thoughts on Mount of Blessing says we should imagine what it was like. They're seated on this hillside. I'll paraphrase it a little bit. The grass is weaving. The trees are there. In the distance, you can see a fella who's throwing seed out. And everybody sits down with expectancy to hear the rabbi speak. And Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And in the midst of that, he says, love your enemies. Do good to church members who don't see everything like you do. Ooh. He really quits preaching and goes to meddling now. And then Jesus says in Luke 6:36 is the very same statement that Jesus gave in Matthew 5:48. Be ye therefore perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. But Luke heard it and chose to emphasize what Jesus really said in the original, which was, hold on, therefore be merciful, just as your Father also is merciful. Moses was identified as the meekest man on earth, of course, only in the sense of as he followed Jesus. Mercy goes beyond meekness, of course. Mercy is an attribute that instead of just saying many are called and few are chosen, we're going to have to disfellowship these people. We're going to, yes, I've got relatives so-and-so, and they're just, I don't know if they'll ever come in, and I don't know what to say. But mercy creates hurt. you actually hurt because somebody has missed the way. And the early Christians were called followers of the way. And Jesus extends mercy to those who don't deserve it. And that begins with the person I see every morning in the mirror. I did not, I will not, I cannot, except through God's wondrous character of love that I can but dimly understand. I cannot experience mercy except that God ordained it. And when Jesus was standing there on that hillside in old Judea of long ago, and he said, "Blessed are those who extend mercy to someone else." That's where the real blessing is. You say, "Oh, Pastor Grams, you're forgetting, how are all these standards and everything going to fit?" Listen. When we understand even dimly the mercy of God, we will uphold the character of God as never before. And drenched in His love, not our own, and clothed in His righteousness, not mine, and anointed with His eye salve, not my myopic glasses, we then will encourage and uplift all that God has asked. And so when we look at these texts, we begin to understand just a little bit more of what Jesus said on the night He was betrayed. In the chapter that we're told by one of our church pioneers, who I'll leave unnamed, but I will identify later in the service, in John the 17th chapter, we find Jesus' greatest burden just before He was killed. He may have been sharing these words either in the upper room or as they were walking the quiet streets of Jerusalem and the vines hanging over some walls. And we look at that, and Jesus says in chapter 17, this is it. "Father, glorify me. Give these people a sense of what it means to manifest your name." And then He goes on by pleading with them to love each other. Not because we're pushing it, but because we have the love of God in our hearts. And then He says in verse 20, "I do not pray for these alone, but also for those who will believe." That's us. "That they may all be one, and you, Father, and me, and I and you." He wants us to be one that the world may believe. I thought the world was going to believe when we could tell enough people they're going to church on the wrong day. No, Jesus said they're going to believe when they see the power of the living God within the church. And people accented and actualized by love that will not let thee go. Not the weak, sentimental love of much of evangelical American Christianity, but the solid, true, substantive love of God that passeth all understanding. And as we have that, we will encourage many to believe. Many, many. I'll tell you, Jesus can hardly wait until we're made one. And in verse 23, that we may be made, again, here's the word we spend a lot of time arguing, perfect. What are we made perfect in? The love that gives us a sense of the mercy of the living God. And in that context, we transcend so many of the arguments on Sabbath afternoon. We transcend the fighting over how perfect should perfect be at the time of the close of probation. And we realize that there's one subject that swallows all other: Christ, our righteousness. And we begin to see, though dimly, that what Jesus was calling for is what Paul called throughout his books. We take our isolated texts and we like to emphasize certain things which do need emphasizing. But you realize one reason we have such little persuasive power among folks of other denominations is that we need to learn, like our Adventist pioneers, to read the books of the New Testament, until from our wide reading of the books that Paul wrote and others, we ferret out those magnificent kernels and nuggets that encapsulate everything else. And so, to those who've really plunged into the Pauline writings, we realize that what he's really calling for is not first and foremost that you weed this, that, and the other out of the assembly of the saints. What he's calling for are people who know how to represent the character, the loveliness, the fragrance of the Son of the living God. And when we understand that fully, more fully, then it is that the true and the standards and all the high ideals will truly be lifted up. We extend to others in the church graciousness when they didn't choose the same lifestyle detail that we might wish they would have. And especially when you're raising children. How many children have been unnecessarily turned away from this church, from the Seventh-day Adventist church, by abrasive older people who were sure that they were following the spirit of prophecy, positive that they were holding up the standard, when they had left reams of the spirit of prophecy out about how to deal with young minds who are just coming into their own and just realizing that they're distinct from mommy and daddy and having to start all over again and establishing their own belief system, which might have a little more latitude in music and whatever. And how many have been driven out? And when you're as old as I am, and you see so many faces that probably could be with us today had who are older understood the Sermon on the Mount and understood what perfection really is. Romans the 12th chapter, just so you have an idea of how Jesus' followers took this theme of perfection. Romans 12:1, I beseech you, or I plead with you, brethren and sisters, by the mercies of God, present your bodies a living sacrifice. See, we want to jump right in and tell people, don't eat those hog jowls anymore, don't do this, don't do that, make sure you're a cheese person. But no, he says, by the mercies of God, lead people to higher ground. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Philip says it so well in his paraphrase, let the world squeeze you into its mold. To those of us that have worked with plaster of Paris, you know exactly what that is. You pour that white liquidy stuff in a mold, and you leave it set, and it comes out in whatever shape you had arranged for it to be in. I'll tell you, don't let the world squeeze you into its mold, but have a mind that is transforming, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and what? What's the word? Perfect will of God. When we extol and live the mercies of God, we will extol the wondrousness of his perfect will. Absolutely incredible. Well, today in closing, I have other texts. If you read 1 John, you read the Psalms, it talks about God's perfection and connected with judgment. You can teach all our doctrines through the concept of perfection as the Bible gives it. But in closing, I'm going to do something different. I'm going to share with you just briefly how Adventist pioneers interpreted what I just taught you, what I've just shared. This is what they said. No, I'm going to change that. I'm going to say how one Adventist pioneer shared it. And I'm going to be even more specific. I'm going to tell you how one of the Seventh-day Adventist Church interpreted everything I just told you. And I'm going to be more specific. It was the woman who co-founded the church. And then I'm going to get carried away and tell you her name. It was Ellen G. White. And then I'm going to tell you that by God's grace, I was in one of the regional churches not very long ago, and I had such a wonderful time, and they gave me the Ellen G. White notes on this quarter. And I'm going to just read a phrase here and there. You think I'm going to stand up here and read you long things? I'm not. I'm going to read you short, pithy little, punchy statements to summarize what I've said. Listen to this. 8T 240. Union with Christ and with one another is our only safety in these last days. That's not what I'm hearing. I'm hearing that the faith box, hold it out. We'll just have to leave the Laodiceans go. Union with Christ and one another is our only safety. You say, oh, but there's all kinds of bad going along. I know. But when you're truly unifying with Christ, you will unify with one another, as Mr. Shin said in Sabbath school. And those spokes will get closer and closer together on the wheel of the church. And then this is awfully heavy. I had a hard time swallowing it. I hope you can. The attribute that Christ appreciates most in man is charity out of a pure heart. Charity is an old English word for love. The attribute he appreciates most. I thought it was something I learned in all my studies and all the details that we're supposed to tell everybody. I'm going to give you one more and one or two more. He can never use anyone who is seeking to humble someone else. Oh, humble yourselves, brethren. Manuscript 47, 1910. Interesting. I'm going to give you one more, and that is one that I hope you could take with you. Letter 141, September 10, 1902. We must learn to bear with the peculiarities of those around us. Shall we all sit for 20 minutes and ponder that one while I sit down? She says we must learn that because we know that the others are peculiar. And sometimes they don't even understand the gospel at all. She says we must learn to bear with the peculiarities of others. I'm going to leave you with this one, Christ's Object Lessons. I'm just going to paraphrase it, but if you want to look it up, because I know some of you won't believe it's actually there, but it's Christ's Object Lessons 384. When the impulse to demand standards, when the impulse to bless others springs constantly from within, then for us, Christ's mission is complete. Has there ever been a better description of perfection? The impulse to bless others. With that in mind, let's take our hymnals and turn, I believe, it has to do with higher ground. Don't you want higher? 625. I'm going to ask us to sing this at my tempo. The students all know about that. And we're going to sing it with alacrity because we want to press on to higher ground. And when we do that, it won't take very long. For those of you who can hardly wait to leave and eat, it won't take us long to sing it, but you'll enjoy the message. Let's sing it together as we stand. Higher ground. Okay, all of us singing together.
I shall stand by faith on heaven's table land.